Nick, do you know what happens to men like you? Emily's voice sliced through the humid air of our living room, venom dripping from every word. She was standing there, wrapped in her silk robe, a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. Her nails, painted that crimson shade she knew I hated, drummed against the stem of the glass. They end up old, bitter, and alone, counting pennies while the rest of us actually live. I didn't respond. Not immediately. My hands were gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles were white. I had spent the last 3 hours combing through our financial statements, and what I'd found had my heart pounding so loudly, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Emily, I finally said, my voice low but firm. Where's the $200,000? Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. Too quickly. What the hell are you talking about? Don't, I snapped, the word sharper than I intended. I slammed the laptop shut and turned to face her. 200,000. Gone. Not accounted for. I just got off the phone with the accountant, and he confirmed it. So don't stand there and pretend you don't know. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, so now you're spying on me? How romantic. This is exactly why I've been telling you to loosen up. Nick, you're so paranoid. Always digging for something to be mad about. Paranoid? I wasn't paranoid, I was furious. I had trusted her with everything. Our finances, our future, our damn lives. And now this, where is the money? I repeated, my voice shaking with the effort it took to keep calm. She rolled her eyes and took a sip of her wine, as if this were all some minor inconvenience. I don't have time for this. If you're going to act like a lunatic, at least do it quietly. I have a Pilates class in the morning, and I need my beauty sleep. She turned on her heel and started walking toward the bedroom. That was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let her brush this off. Not this time. Emily, I barked and she froze mid-step. Slowly, she turned back to me, her face a mask of disdain. You're not walking away from this. Not tonight. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw something in them I hadn't noticed before. Contempt. Pure, unfiltered contempt. Or what, Nick? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. What are you going to do? Lecture me about responsibility? Maybe print out a spreadsheet? God, you're pathetic. I didn't answer. I didn't have to, because in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach churn. This wasn't just about the money. It was bigger than that, darker. And whatever Emily was hiding, it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The next morning, I didn't bother trying to talk to her. What was the point? Emily had mastered the art of deflection. She could turn any accusation into an attack, any demand into a joke. But this time, I wasn't relying on her to tell me the truth. I was going to find it myself. I called my accountant first thing. Rob, I need you to pull every transaction from the last 18 months. Business, personal, everything. I don't care how long it takes or how messy it gets. I need to know where that money went. Rob hesitated. Nick, you sure you want to go down this road? Sometimes it's better not to know. Just do it, I said, my voice cold. And don't tell anyone. Not even your assistant. I spent the rest of the day digging through what I already had. Bank statements, credit card bills, random receipts crumpled in the bottom of her designer tote bags. A pattern started to emerge. Expensive dinners at places I'd never been, high-end boutiques in cities we hadn't visited together, and, most damning of all, hotel charges. Multiple. All under her name. By the time Rob called me back that evening, I already knew where this was headed. But nothing could have prepared me for what he said. Nick, Rob began, his voice uneasy. I don't know how to say this, but there's a lot more going on than just missing money. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He hesitated again, then sighed. There's a separate account. Offshore. Under Emily's maiden name. It's been active for over a year. An offshore account? My mind raced, trying to process what that meant. Emily didn't handle our finances. She always left that to me. For her to go out of her way to set up a secret account, she must have had a reason. And it wasn't a good one. How much is in it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Just shy of $200,000, Rob said. But there's something else. She's been funneling money from your business account into this one. It's subtle, small transfers here and there, but over time it adds up. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This wasn't just betrayal, it was theft, fraud, and she had been doing it right under my nose. Rob, I said, gripping the phone so hard my hands started to ache. I need you to send me everything you've got. Every transaction, every detail. Already done, he replied. But, Nick, what are you going to do? I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the truth was I didn't know. Emily had crossed a line, but this wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about her, the person I thought I knew, the person I had built a life with, and the growing realization that I had been living a lie. That night, I watched her from across the dinner table, the same way you'd watch a stranger. She laughed at something on her phone, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She had no idea that I knew, no idea that her carefully constructed web of lies was starting to unravel. But I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I needed a plan, something precise, calculated. Something that would make her feel every ounce of the betrayal she had inflicted on me. So I smiled at her, played along, and waited. Because when I struck, I wanted it to hurt. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss, pretending everything was fine while my world was crumbling beneath me. Emily carried on as if nothing had happened, morning yoga, long lunches with her friends, and the occasional cryptic phone call she always took in another room. She was an actress playing the role of a perfect wife, and I was the fool applauding her performance. But I wasn't sitting idle. While she was out, I started piecing together her secrets, one thread at a time. The offshore account wasn't just a stash of stolen money. It was a financial lifeline she had built for herself. And then there was the hotel, a boutique spot downtown where she had apparently become a regular. I called, pretending to be her assistant, and the concierge's warm familiarity with her name sent a fresh wave of anger through me. Yes, Mrs. Adams has been a guest quite frequently. Shall I confirm her next booking for next week? Or would she prefer a different suite this time? Next week. Another hotel visit, another lie. My jaw clenched as I forced myself to thank the concierge and hang up. She wasn't even trying to hide it. It wasn't just disrespect, it was arrogance. She thought I was too blind, too naive, or too weak to notice. By the time she came home that evening, I was sitting in the living room, laptop open, reviewing the evidence I had gathered. She waltzed in wearing a new outfit, designer, of course, carrying yet another luxury shopping bag. She dropped it on the floor with a grin that was all too smug. Guess what, Nick? I got a steal on this today. Half off. Aren't you proud of me for saving money? Her laugh echoed in the room as she kicked off her heels and collapsed onto the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing in the world could touch her. I stared at her, my stomach twisting with a mix of disgust and cold determination. She was mocking me whether she realized it or not, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I nodded and forced a small smile. That's great, I said, keeping my tone light. Every little bit helps, right? She didn't even look up from her phone. See? You worry too much. I've got everything under control. That was her mistake. Her arrogance. She thought she had me fooled. But she was wrong. Very wrong. The next morning I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a shark. The kind of lawyer you only hire when you're planning to go nuclear. I laid everything out. The missing money, the offshore account, the stolen business funds. He listened quietly, taking notes, then leaned back in his chair with a wry smile. Nick, you've got her. If this goes to court, she's going to lose. Big time. But before we make any moves, let me ask you something. How far are you willing to go? I didn't hesitate. As far as it takes. The lawyer nodded. Then here's what we're going to do. His plan was brilliant, ruthless, and exactly what I needed. It wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about dismantling the life she had built on my trust and making sure she couldn't crawl out of the rubble unscathed. And so, while Emily continued her charade, I set the wheels in motion. One by one, her designer purses began to disappear. At first, I replaced them with high-quality replicas so she wouldn't notice. Then, I sold the originals, quietly funneling the money into a private account to pay for my legal fees. Every time she strutted out the door with a fake bag on her arm, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She had built her life on lies. Now, I was about to dismantle it piece by piece. And the best part? She still had no idea. The turning point came one Friday evening, when Emily strutted through the door with a new level of smugness plastered across her face. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she carried in another shopping bag. Hermes this time. She didn't even acknowledge me as she placed it on the dining table like it was some trophy. "Guess who got invited to the Lakewood Charity Gala?" she announced, her voice dripping with fake excitement. Apparently, the Robinsons think I'd be a perfect fit for their social circle. Can you imagine? Me mingling with actual society elites. She was baiting me, as she always did. The subtext was clear. I'm better than you. I deserve more than you can offer. But instead of letting it rile me up, I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers, and gave her a calm, measured smile. "That's wonderful, Em. Just let me know if you need anything for the event." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she wasn't sure how to process my lack of resistance. "I will," she said slowly, then disappeared into the bedroom to admire her latest purchase. That's when I made my next move. I'd already replaced most of her luxury bags with replicas, but now I decided to take it a step further. That Hermes bag? Gone. I had it listed for auction before she even fell asleep that night, and the bids were already climbing into the thousands. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the principle. Every time I sold one of her prized possessions, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. The next morning, she noticed something was off. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when I heard her voice from the closet. "Nick," she called, irritation creeping into her tone. "Have you seen my Chanel tote? The white one?" I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her wonder. Then I called back. "No idea. Did you misplace it?" She appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression skeptical. "I could have sworn I left it right here. You didn't touch it, did you?" I shrugged, feigning disinterest. "Why would I touch your bag, Em? Maybe it's in the car." She stared at me for a moment, her eyes scanning my face as if trying to detect a crack in my facade. When she didn't find one, she huffed and turned away, muttering something under her breath. But the cracks were already forming, just not where she thought. That day, I finalized my arrangements with the lawyer. The evidence was overwhelming. The offshore account, the diverted funds, and now the mounting proof that she was siphoning money to support a life she didn't deserve. The legal team was ready, and so was I. The next week, Emily's carefully constructed world began to wobble. Her credit card was declined at a boutique, and she came home fuming. "Nick," she snapped, slamming her keys on the counter. "Why is the Amex not working?" I looked up from my laptop, playing dumb. "That's strange. I'll call the bank and check." "Strange?" she spat, pacing back and forth. "You've been doing something, haven't you? You're always tinkering with accounts and pretending to be the responsible one." God, this is humiliating. Her anger didn't faze me. I knew exactly what was happening. I had called the credit card company days ago and flagged the account for unusual activity. It was a simple precaution, I told them, just to make sure no one else was using it. They froze the account immediately, pending a review. "Relax," I said, my voice even. "I'm sure it's just a mix-up. I'll handle it." She glared at me, her frustration palpable, but she didn't press further. Not yet. She was too proud to admit she was losing control, too convinced of her own invincibility to see what was really happening. That night, I watched her as she scrolled through her phone, probably searching for another scapegoat to blame. She had no idea what was coming. No idea that the life she had built on lies and stolen money was about to collapse. And I wasn't just going to watch it fall, I was going to make sure it burned. The unraveling began on a Saturday morning. Emily was sitting at the kitchen counter, sipping her green juice, scrolling through her phone like it was an extension of her hand. I had barely finished my coffee when she suddenly froze, her finger hovering mid-scroll. Her face paled, and her jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might snap her teeth. "Nick," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Where is my Hermes bag?" I looked up from the newspaper, feigning confusion. "Which one?" Her eyes narrowed, blazing with suspicion. "The new one. The one I just bought. Don't play dumb with me." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "I wouldn't know, Em. You're the one with enough bags to open a boutique. Maybe it's wherever your Chanel tote went. Her face turned crimson, and for the first time in weeks, I saw genuine panic flicker behind her anger. She stormed out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she tore through the closet, slamming drawers and yanking hangers. She was muttering under her breath, her words barely audible but dripping with frustration. I followed her casually, leaning against the doorway of the walk-in closet as she ransacked it. "Lose something important?" I asked, my tone dripping with mock concern. She spun around, glaring at me like a cornered animal. "This isn't funny, Nick. First my Chanel, now my Hermes? Don't tell me this is a coincidence. What the hell is going on?" I shrugged. "I have no idea, Em. Maybe you should be more careful with your things. Luxury items tend to disappear when you don't value them. Don't you think?" Her lips parted, ready to fire back, but then she stopped. Her expression shifted, less anger, more calculation. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to piece together a puzzle that was slowly crumbling in her hands. "You're lying," she hissed. "I don't know how, but you're behind this." I didn't flinch. Instead, I gave her a slow, deliberate smile. "Why would I need to, Em? You've always been so independent, haven't you? Always reminding me how much better you could do, how much smarter you are. So why would you need me to keep track of your things?" Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw the mask slip. Fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. She was finally realizing that she wasn't in control anymore. She stormed out of the closet, grabbing her phone. I watched her as she paced the living room, frantically calling boutiques, friends, anyone she could think of who might help her piece together what was happening. I could hear snippets of her conversations, her voice climbing higher with every call. "No, I didn't misplace it. Are you sure there wasn't a mistake at checkout? What do you mean it's already been resold? That's impossible." I stood there, sipping my coffee, enjoying the show. She was unraveling faster than I expected, and it was satisfying in a way I couldn't fully describe. This was the woman who had stolen from me, lied to me, and flaunted her deceit like it was a badge of honor. Watching her scramble to maintain her facade was almost poetic. But the real blow came later that afternoon. She was sitting on the couch, her phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip, when she suddenly froze again. Her eyes darted across the screen, her mouth falling open. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What's wrong, Em?" I asked, keeping my tone light, almost cheerful. She didn't answer. She just turned the phone toward me, her hand trembling. On the screen was an auction listing, a very familiar Hermes bag sold for several $1,000s. The username of the seller? A throwaway account I had set up, one she could never trace back to me. Her head snapped toward me, her face a mix of rage and disbelief. You sold my bag?" I took my time, setting down my coffee mug before meeting her gaze. "No, Em," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I sold my bag, just like you stole my money." Her face twisted in fury, and for a moment, I thought she might throw something. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. "You think this is funny?" she spat. "You think you can just do this to me and get away with it?" I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Funny? No. Satisfying? Absolutely. And as for getting away with it, you've been doing that for years, haven't you? But guess what, Emily? Your little game is over." She stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. For the first time, she didn't have a snarky comeback, no clever retort to throw in my face. She was silent, and in that silence I saw it, the realization that she was losing control. And I wasn't done yet. Not even close. Emily spent the rest of the day pacing the house like a trapped animal, her phone glued to her ear as she tried to unravel the mess I had carefully orchestrated. Every conversation ended the same, with her cursing under her breath and throwing her phone onto the nearest surface. It was chaos, and I was enjoying every second of it. By evening, she cornered me in the living room. Her face was flushed, her hair disheveled from constantly running her hands through it. She looked less like the polished, put-together Emily I'd married and more like a woman on the verge of breaking. "Nick," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Whatever game you're playing, you need to stop. Now." I didn't look up from the book I was pretending to read. Game? I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't, she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Don't act like you're innocent. You think I don't know? The bags, the credit cards, this is you. You're sabotaging me. I closed the book slowly, setting it down on the coffee table. Sabotaging you? Emily, you've been sabotaging yourself for years. I'm just leveling the playing field. Her eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms, her voice dropping into a low, venomous hiss. Do you even understand what you're doing? You're ruining me. My reputation, my connections, everything I've worked for. Do you even care? I stood up, towering over her, and for the first time, I let the anger I'd been holding back seep into my voice. Do I care? Did you care when you drained $200,000 from our accounts? Did you care when you funneled my business funds into your little offshore account? Did you care when you lied to my face? Over and over again. She flinched, but the defiance in her eyes didn't waver. You don't understand. I had to do it, Nick. I needed that money. For what? I interrupted, stepping closer. Another bag? Another spa day? Or was it for the hotel rooms you've been booking behind my back? Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. That was it, the first real crack in her armor. She knew I'd caught her, and for once, she didn't have a rehearsed excuse ready to go. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice unsteady. I laughed. A bitter, humorless sound. Don't I? Because I've got the receipts, Emily. Every transaction, every hotel charge, every dime you stole from me. And let me tell you, when this goes to court, the judge is going to have a field day with it. Her bravado faltered, and for the first time, I saw something new in her eyes. Fear. But it didn't last long. She straightened her shoulders, tilting her chin up in defiance. You think you're so clever, don't you? Well, newsflash, Nick, you're not. You might have your little evidence, but no one's going to believe you. Not after I tell them how controlling you are, how suffocating you've been. I shook my head, almost in disbelief at her audacity. You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about control. It's about justice. You've been stealing from me, Emily, stealing from us. And now, it's all going to come crashing down. She opened her mouth to fire back, but I held up a hand to stop her. Save it. I've already talked to my lawyer. We're done, Emily. You're done. Her jaw dropped, and for a moment, she was completely speechless. Then she laughed. A cold, bitter sound that sent a chill down my spine. Oh, you think it's that easy? You think you can just walk away and leave me with nothing? I don't think, I said, my voice firm and steady. I know, because when this is over, you'll be lucky if you leave with the clothes on your back. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. And then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. I watched her go, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the house. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. She had always been the one pulling the strings, but now the tables had turned. The next morning, Emily was eerily quiet. She didn't slam doors or pace the house in a huff. Instead, she sat at the dining table, scrolling through her phone with a blank expression, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was the calm before the storm, and I knew better than to trust it. Emily was a strategist when cornered, and silence meant she was plotting. I let her stew while I made coffee, pretending not to notice the tension radiating off her. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I casually glanced at the notification. It was from my lawyer, confirming the next steps we'd discussed. Emily's gaze flicked toward me, sharp and calculating. Busy morning? She asked, her tone too sweet to be genuine. I looked at her and smiled. Just work. You know how it is. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press further. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs in that practiced, effortless way she always did when she wanted to appear unbothered. Well, I hope you're ready for a busy week. I've decided to host a dinner party on Friday. Just a few friends, nothing extravagant. It was a power play, plain and simple. Emily never did anything without a reason, and hosting a party was her way of asserting dominance. She wanted to remind me, and everyone else, that she was still in control, still the queen of her carefully curated world. Sounds great, I said, masking my amusement. "Let me know how I can help." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, don't worry. I've got it all handled." She stood up, brushing invisible dust off her robe, and sauntered out of the room, leaving the faint scent of her overpriced perfume in her wake. I watched her go, a small smirk tugging at the corner of my lips. Let her have her party. By the time Friday rolled around, her kingdom would be in ashes. The rest of the week was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Emily played the role of the perfect wife, planning her party with meticulous detail while simultaneously trying to bait me into arguments. I stayed calm, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted, and it drove her mad. I could see it in the way her smile grew tighter, her tone sharper, her movements more frantic. Meanwhile, I was tying up the loose ends of my plan. I had gathered everything I needed: evidence of her theft, proof of her infidelity, and a legal strategy so airtight, not even her manipulative charm could poke holes in it. The offshore account was the crown jewel, irrefutable proof of her deceit, and I couldn't wait to see her face when it all came crashing down. But the piece de resistance? The party itself. I wasn't just going to let her throw her little soiree. I was going to turn it into a spectacle she'd never forget. Friday arrived, and the house was transformed. Emily had spared no expense, hiring a catering team, a floral designer, and even a string quartet to set the mood. The guest list was a who's who of her social circle: women who gossiped behind each other's backs, men who flaunted their wealth like trophies. It was the kind of crowd Emily thrived in, where appearances were everything and vulnerability was a sign of weakness. I played my part perfectly, greeting guests with a warm smile, making polite conversation, and letting Emily bask in the spotlight. She wore a dress that probably cost more than my first car, her diamond earrings catching the light as she laughed and charmed everyone in the room. For a moment, I almost admired her audacity. Standing there, acting like the perfect hostess, while the walls of her empire were crumbling around her. Halfway through the evening, I excused myself and slipped upstairs to my office. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I had prepared. With a few clicks, I sent everything to the people who mattered most: her friends, her family, even a few of her high society contacts. Bank statements, receipts, photos from her hotel escapades. It was all there, laid out in cold, hard evidence. Then I returned to the party, blending seamlessly back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Emily was in her element, laughing with her friends, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. The first text came within minutes, then another, and another. I watched as the color drained from Emily's face, her phone lighting up with a flurry of messages. She excused herself from the group, retreating to the corner of the room as she read the damning evidence that had just been dropped into her lap. When she finally looked up, our eyes met across the room. For a moment, everything else faded away. The chatter of the guests, the music, the clinking of glasses. It was just the two of us, locked in a silent battle. Her expression was a mix of shock, rage, and desperation, and I knew she was scrambling to figure out her next move. But there was no move to make. I had checkmated her, and we both knew it. She stormed over to me, her heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. "What the hell did you do?" she hissed, her voice low but furious. I smiled, leaning in so only she could hear me. "I told the truth, Emily. Something you should have tried for once." Her hand twitched like she wanted to slap me, but she couldn't risk the scene. Not here. Not in front of her precious audience. Instead, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the kitchen, her composure barely holding together. The rest of the night was a blur of whispers and stolen glances. The guests knew something was off, but no one dared to address it directly. By the time the last person left, the house was eerily silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Emily was waiting for me in the living room, her arms crossed, her eyes blazing with fury. "You just ruined my life," she spat. "No, Emily," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You did that all by yourself." Emily didn't sleep that night. I could hear her pacing the upstairs hallway, the sharp clack of her heels on the hardwood floor echoing through the house. Every so often, she'd pause, probably to check her phone again, hoping the messages had stopped. They hadn't. By the time I finally came upstairs, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said without looking at me. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but I could hear the venom underneath. You think this is over? I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. It's over, Emily. You just don't want to admit it. She finally turned to face me, her eyes red and glassy, but not from tears. Emily didn't cry. No, this was rage. The kind that simmered just below the surface, waiting for an opportunity to explode. You don't understand, she said, shaking her head. You've destroyed everything. My friends, my reputation, my life. Do you know how hard I've worked to get where I am? Hard work. I laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. You call stealing from me and lying to everyone hard work? You've been living a life you didn't earn, Emily. And now the bills come due. She stood up, her movements quick and jerky, like she was barely holding herself together. You're pathetic, she spat. You couldn't handle a woman like me, so you decided to tear me down instead. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Your fragile ego. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could see the faint tremble in her hands. This isn't about my ego, Emily. It's about justice. You took $200,000 from me. You lied, cheated, and humiliated me. And for what? So you could prance around in your designer clothes and pretend you're better than everyone else. Her lips curled into a sneer. Better than you, at least. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just angry. She was delusional. Emily still thought she had the upper hand, even as her world crumbled around her. It would have been almost impressive if it weren't so infuriating. Enjoy the view from your high horse, I said, stepping back. It's a long way down. I left her standing there, seething, and went to the guest room. I didn't want to be anywhere near her when the rest of the fallout hit. The next morning, I was greeted by a knock at the door. I opened it to find a courier holding an envelope with Emily's name on it. She appeared in the hallway, her robe pulled tightly around her, her face pale but defiant. What is that? She demanded. I handed her the envelope. Looks like your next move. She snatched it from my hand, tore it open, and scanned the contents. Her face twisted into a mask of fury. You've got to be kidding me. What is it? I asked, feigning ignorance. She threw the papers at me, her voice trembling with anger. A freeze on my offshore account. You had no right. I picked up the papers and scanned them, my heart racing with satisfaction. My lawyer had pulled through. The account was flagged for investigation, tied directly to the funds she had siphoned from my business. She couldn't touch a dime of it now. You mean our offshore account? I said, my voice calm. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's money you stole from me. And now it's locked down until the courts decide what to do with it. Her scream of frustration echoed through the house. She grabbed her phone, no doubt to call her lawyer, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She was trapped, and for the first time, she knew it. Later that day, I made my final move. I had been holding on to one last piece of evidence. A detailed spreadsheet showing every dollar she had funneled out of our accounts, alongside receipts for her personal expenses. I handed it over to my lawyer, who filed it with the court that same afternoon. It was airtight, and it would be the final nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed life. That evening, Emily cornered me in the kitchen. Her eyes were wild, her voice raw with desperation. Nick, please, she said, her tone almost pleading. We can fix this. We can make it work. Just stop all of this. I stared at her, feeling nothing but cold detachment. You had your chance, Emily. You chose to betray me. This is just the result of your own actions. Her face crumpled for a moment, but then she straightened, her mask slipping back into place. Fine, she said, her voice hard. You want a war? You've got one. But don't think for a second I'm going down without a fight. I smirked, stepping past her. Bring it, Emily. Just remember, every move you make, I'm already 3 steps ahead. She didn't respond, and for the first time, I saw the faintest flicker of defeat in her eyes. The game was over, and she knew it. But Emily wasn't the type to admit she'd lost. Not yet. Anyway, and that was fine. I was patient. I could wait. The cracks in Emily's facade began to widen the following day. The texts from her friends, once filled with praise and shallow admiration, had grown colder, sharper, laced with questions she couldn't answer. The rumors had started spreading like wildfire. and her carefully curated image was disintegrating with every passing hour. I watched it all unfold from a distance, not needing to lift a finger. The web she'd spun for herself was collapsing, and I knew the best thing I could do was let it happen. Emily had always thrived on control, but now, control was slipping through her fingers. By mid-afternoon, she snapped. I was in my office reviewing a draft from my lawyer when the door slammed open. She stormed in, her eyes blazing with fury, holding her phone like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "You're ruining me!" she screamed, slamming the phone down on my desk. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I leaned back in my chair, unfazed. "What I've done?" I repeated, my voice calm. "Emily, I think you need to look in the mirror. You did this to yourself." She laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "Oh, don't give me that self-righteous crap. You think you're some kind of hero for exposing me? You're just a bitter little man who couldn't handle a strong woman." "Strong?" I said, standing up and towering over her. "Emily, there's nothing strong about what you've done. You lied. You stole. You betrayed me, and now you're paying the price. Don't confuse arrogance for strength." Her expression faltered for a split second before hardening again. "Do you think this makes you better than me? Because it doesn't. You're just as pathetic as the rest of them, clinging to some outdated idea of loyalty while I was building a future for myself. A future built on lies." I shot back, stepping closer. "And now that future's gone. Your friends? Gone. Your reputation? Gone. That little nest egg you were stashing away? Frozen. Face it, Emily, you gambled and you lost." For a moment, she looked like she might break. Her lips quivered, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But then, as if flipping a switch, she plastered on a cold, calculated smile. "You think you've won," she said, her voice steady but dripping with venom. "But you'll see, Nick, this isn't over. You might have embarrassed me, but you haven't destroyed me. I'll rebuild, and when I do, I'll make sure you regret every second of this." I laughed, the sound low and humorless. "Good luck with that, Em. Let me know how you plan to rebuild when you can't even afford a latte without my alimony." Her smile faltered, and for the first time, she looked genuinely stunned. "Alimony?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I picked up the folder sitting on my desk and held it out to her. "The court hearing is in 2 weeks. My lawyer has already filed for temporary support. Since you drained our accounts to fund your lifestyle, it's only fair that you pay for the damage you caused." Her hands shook as she took the folder, flipping through the pages with growing disbelief. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "You want me to pay you?" "Why not?" I said with a shrug. "You've taken enough from me. Consider this repayment." Her face twisted with rage, and she threw the folder onto the desk, the papers scattering everywhere. "You're a monster," she spat. "You've always been a monster. I should have left you years ago." I leaned in, my voice low and steady. "You should have, Emily, but you didn't. And now you'll have to live with the consequences of every choice you made." She stormed out of the office, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, feeling a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of her. I wasn't afraid of what she'd say or do. She had spent years building herself up at my expense. But now the power was mine, and I wasn't about to give it back. Emily didn't return to the house that night. I heard her car tear out of the driveway, tires screeching, as the sun dipped below the horizon. She didn't text, didn't call, didn't try to claw her way back into control with one of her manipulative games. I'd expected a fight, but her sudden retreat told me she was regrouping, planning her next move. That was fine. Let her try. I wasn't about to lose the upper hand now. The next day, I met with my lawyer again to finalize the details for the upcoming court hearing. He was confident, even amused at the irony of the situation. "You don't see this often," he said, flipping through the stack of evidence I'd compiled. "A wife being ordered to pay alimony to the husband. Judges usually balk at the idea. But with everything you've got here, she doesn't stand a chance." "Good," I said, my voice firm. "I don't want this to just be a win on paper. I want it to sting. She deserves to feel the weight of what she's done." He nodded, closing the folder. "She will. Trust me, Nick." By the time this is over, she won't have a leg to stand on. That evening, Emily came back. I heard her car pull into the driveway, the slow, deliberate crunch of gravel signaling her return. When she walked through the door, her usual air of superiority was gone. She looked worn, like someone who had been chewed up and spit out by the very world she once ruled over. But her eyes still burned with defiance. She wasn't defeated yet. She found me in the living room, sitting calmly with a glass of whiskey. For a moment, she just stood there, as if trying to decide how to approach. Then she crossed her arms and said, "We need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from me. "By all means." She sat down, her posture stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You've made your point, Nick. Congratulations. You've humiliated me, ruined my reputation, and turned my life into a spectacle. Are you happy?" "Not yet," I said, taking a sip of whiskey. "But I'm getting there." Her jaw tightened, but she pressed on. "This isn't sustainable. You know that, right? You can't keep dragging this out, tearing us both apart. We need to come to an agreement." "An agreement?" I raised an eyebrow. "Like the one we had when you promised to be honest? Or the one where you didn't steal 200 grand from me? Which agreement are we talking about here?" She flinched, but she recovered quickly. "I'm offering you a way out. If we settle this quietly, I'll walk away. No alimony, no fights, nothing. You can keep the house, the business, everything. Just let me leave with some dignity." I leaned forward, setting my glass down on the table. "Dignity? Emily, you lost that the moment you started siphoning money out of our accounts and booking hotels with God knows who. This isn't about dignity. It's about accountability. And for once in your life, you're going to face it." Her mask cracked, just for a moment. I saw the panic behind her eyes, the realization that her last-ditch effort to control the narrative wasn't working. She shifted in her seat, her voice growing softer, more desperate. "Nick, please. I'm trying to make this right." "No, Emily," I said, my voice cold. "You're trying to save yourself, and it's too late for that." She stood abruptly, knocking the chair back slightly. Her hands were trembling now, her carefully maintained composure slipping away. "You're going to regret this," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "When this is all over, you'll realize you've destroyed both of us." I stood too, towering over her. "No, Emily. I'll realize I finally stopped letting you destroy me." She stared at me for a long moment, her lips pressed into a tight line. Then, without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The court hearing came faster than I expected, and Emily walked in with that same air of defiance she'd always had, though it was now tinged with desperation. Her lawyer tried everything, arguing that she was entitled to a portion of my business, that her spending was part of our lifestyle, that the offshore account wasn't hers but a joint investment. None of it held up. The evidence was damning, and the judge saw right through her lies. When the ruling came down, it was almost poetic. Emily was ordered to pay me alimony, as well as restitution for the money she had stolen. Her offshore account, drained to cover court costs and damages. The life she had built, the one she had stolen to maintain, was gone in an instant. She didn't look at me as we left the courtroom. Her once proud stride was now slow and defeated. Her head bowed as the reporters outside snapped photos and shouted questions. For the first time, Emily had nothing to say, and as I walked past her, out into the crisp air of freedom, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. In the days after the court ruling, the fallout for Emily was swift and merciless. Her friends, the ones who had flocked to her for her glamour and connections, vanished overnight. The whispers in her precious social circles turned into outright ridicule. She was no longer the queen of the scene. She was a cautionary tale. Her designer lifestyle, funded by lies and stolen money, collapsed like a house of cards. The handbags she still thought were real, worthless fakes. The luxury cars she loved to flaunt, repossessed. The boutique gym and spa memberships she bragged about, canceled. She'd burned through every bridge, and now she was standing in the ashes of her own arrogance. I, on the other hand, was rebuilding. My lawyer had helped me secure my finances, and with the restitution payments Emily now owed me, I was able to stabilize the business she had nearly destroyed. For the first time in years, I could breathe again, free from the constant weight of her manipulation. One day, I got a call from an old mutual acquaintance, a man I hadn't heard from in years, but who had always been one of the few genuine people in Emily's orbit. "Nick," he said, his voice hesitant. "I don't know if you've heard, but Emily's, well, she's not doing great." I didn't respond right away, unsure of what he was trying to say. "She's been staying at a friend's place," he continued. "But, I don't think she'll be there much longer. Word is she's trying to move out of town. Start over." "Is that supposed to make me feel sorry for her?" I asked, my tone flat. He paused, then sighed. "No, I suppose not. Just thought you'd want to know." I hung up, shaking my head. It was fitting in a way. Emily had always been about appearances, about crafting an image of perfection. Now, she was running from the ruins of that image, trying to escape the wreckage she'd created. But there was no escaping it, not this time. The last time I saw her was at a coffee shop downtown. It was purely by chance. I was meeting a client, and she was sitting alone in the corner, nursing a small black coffee. She looked different, almost unrecognizable. Her hair wasn't styled, her nails weren't done, and she was dressed in plain clothes that could have come from any department store clearance rack. For a moment, I almost felt pity for her. She noticed me, her eyes widening slightly before she looked away, pretending not to see me. There was no confrontation, no words exchanged. But in that brief glance, I saw everything I needed to know. She wasn't the Emily I had married, the Emily who had once charmed everyone in the room. She was a shadow of herself, a woman stripped of the power and arrogance she had used to define her life. I turned away and walked out without saying a word. She wasn't my problem anymore. She had made her choices, and now she was living with them. As I stood outside the coffee shop, I felt the cool breeze on my face and smiled. For the first time in years, I was free. Free of her lies, her manipulation, and the constant chaos she brought into my life. Justice had been served, and Emily's downfall was complete. I didn't feel sorry for her. She had spent years tearing me down, and now she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. This was her reckoning, and it was long overdue. Sometimes, life has a way of balancing the scales, even when it takes longer than you'd hoped. And as I walked away, leaving Emily and her shattered world behind, I felt nothing but peace.